is the class structures that we're going to talk about today. Our topic today is a conversation around class structures in Liberia. My guests are Dr. Herbert Brewer. Dr. Brewer, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you for having me, Dennis.
Professor Herbert Brewer is a historian of the Atlantic world and in particular 18th and 19th century African-American life and culture. His research focuses on the African-American diaspora in the Atlantic world. He's currently writing a biography of Joseph Jenkins Roberts, that's Liberia's first president. He has taught in the Washington, D.C. public schools and served as the administrator of the University of Maryland's Miller Center for Historical Studies. He has taught history at the University of Maryland at College Park, the University of Maryland at Baltimore County, and at Morgan State University in Baltimore, where he currently serves as an assistant professor of history and coordinator of the African American and African Diaspora Studies program. Once again, Dr. Brewer, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you.
Next, we have who currently in East Africa, that's in Nairobi, Kenya, Ms. Korto Williams. Korto, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you for having me.
Korto is the country director of Action Aid in Liberia. She has vast development experience working in post-conflict reconstruction and development issues in Liberia. She has had numerous short-term experience in program development and assessments in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Burundi, Haiti, Sierra Leone, and the Middle East, that is Jordan and Palestine. Before joining Action Aid, she worked with a variety of development institutions, including the U.S. Agency for International Development, the UN Development Program, and the International Foundation for Education and Self-Help. She's a strategic civil society leader in Liberia and works on women organizing on the issues of women's rights, feminism, aid effectiveness, and youth development. Korto holds a master's degree in sustainable development from the School of International Training in Vermont, USA, and that's right now that's the SIT Graduate Institute. She also has a certificate in mobilizing your nonprofit board from Harvard University XED training in 2014. Ms. Williams, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, and let me make a small correction. I am not the country director of Action Aid Liberia. I work as the global head of Action Aid Women's Rights Program. So the position of country director, Action Aid Liberia, I left that about 3 years ago, and there is a new country director. So I just want to make that correction because I know there are people who are listening and will, get confused.
Right. So it means you got promoted or what?
No, I got a new job. It wasn't.
You got a new something.
Yeah, I applied for a new job and got it. Yes.
Oh, okay. So right now you are in Nairobi, Kenya.
I'm in Nairobi, Kenya. Action Aid International has a hub here, and I work as the global head of women's rights. That is working with the 45 countries within the Action Aid Federation. But I also would like this to be less about Action Aid and more about the work that I have done with the Liberian Feminist Forum as a co-creator of the Liberian Feminist Forum, and also as a civil society, strategic civil society leader in Liberia. So a little less about Action Aid will be good, yes.
Right, okay. Well, we want to welcome all our viewers across the globe. This is our Focus on Liberia. Our topic, again, is class structures in Liberia. So let me start with you, Korto, because this is, what is class? Because when you say class structure in Liberia, to many of us, that's a kind of new concept. What is class? And when we say class structure, what does that mean?
Okay, thanks, Dennis. I will define class. I know that definitions vary, but I also want to start by saying that the reason we're here, Herbert and myself, is really to initiate and nurture a fresh and innovative political thinking debate, perhaps after we get through talking, and then action, so that it serves as a starting point to understand and negotiate our differences as Liberians, and also to be able to find common ground that takes us forward as a people. So class in relationship to that is, I would say, a relative social ranking that is based on several different areas. So it could be economic, so income, wealth. It also has to do with connection. So I would say family lineage. But then there are also the social statuses that has to do with education, proximity to power, you know, a general status within a society. Having said that, I believe that classism is what we are speaking about more as we progress in the conversation. So it is that institutional, cultural, and individual set of practices and beliefs that then assigns, you know, different values, differential values to people based on their class. So based on their social-economic class, but then there's also the economic system, which then, Herbert mentioned it earlier, which then deals with, fuels inequality within societies and causes human beings to, you know, to have one group of people in poverty, another group of people living, you know, at different rungs of the ladder as it relates to poverty and wealth. So in short, you know, I would say that is how I understand class, and that is the sort of lens that I apply when I speak about class.
So Dr. Brewer, we say class, there are class structures in Liberia. To me, that's a new concept, because historically, I know, most of us know, you know, our ethnicity, you know, country and conquer. But if you say class system do or class structure do exist in Liberia, what's the history? Or is it something just started?
So as Korto, right, as Korto just mentioned, thinking about class is a way to create a framework, a way to understand, a lens through which to look at the society, look at how divisions in the society operate. And class divisions are a type of division. There are many different types of divisions in the society, but class divisions are an important kind of division. And thinking about this, the way the society is organized from the point of view of classes would be a way that it would help us, would explain, would go much further in explaining activities, actions, practices that people are involved in. Indeed, explaining certain types of results that occur in the society, how decisions get made, how to interpret what's going on. And in that sense, Liberia wouldn't be different from all the other countries in the world. We're talking about something that's global. Also, it's something that's historical, you know, that the classes don't just appear suddenly. Classes are built, you know, they're created, they're reproduced. Classes grow in antagonism with you know, with each other, these other classes. And so we can look into specific concrete circumstances of Liberia to see, you know, what's the record and what's the history of class formation and reconstitution, et cetera, through Liberia's history. But again, fundamentally, yes, classes are about hierarchy, about social, you know, social strata, you know, levels, et cetera, in the society. But those things are tied to a whole variety of things, especially power, resources, you know, economics, those sorts of things. And so classes sort of define themselves oftentimes in contention with each other. Actually, that's one of the ways in which classes become defined over these struggles, you know, over resources and how these resources are distributed, over who controls these things, as Korto was saying, who has access to a certain, you know, the state power. And indeed, the state itself is not autonomous from class struggles. It's very much actually a site of that struggle amongst these various groups. But I think what we're trying to offer up here is an alternative analysis, an alternative explanation for why things are going or have gone the way they've gone, and why things are going the way they're going. I would argue that for the most part, when the conversation, the national conversation takes place, there tends to be a focus on individuals, and to the absence of just discussions of structural realities over there, and what I call the great man theory of history. Everything is either the fault of this man or that man, and all we need is a good man to replace a bad man, and some things would happen. But what a class analysis does is that it forces us to look beyond the individual actors themselves and look at the structures within which they operate, which they themselves are the products of, that sort of thing. So I would start there by saying that this is like an alternative way of explaining and understanding that Liberian reality. Another sort of framework that the class analysis challenges is that framework of ethnic determinism, which also in the case of Liberia is again a dominant sort of way of thinking about how you explain the actions of people.
Right, and that's where I was going when I said most of the time what we know is that there are two big classes, country and conquer, or we come and subdivide ourselves along ethnic lines. So give me some of examples of these class structures in Liberia apart from our ethnicity.
Well, I mean, so if you think about the Liberian society itself, there are rich people, there are poor people. But all rich people are not the same, and all poor people are not the same either. There are regional variations within. There are people who live in rural areas, there are people who live in urban areas. And so it's not an undifferentiated mass. But if you look at the state itself, if you look at the national resources, if you look at where wealth comes from in the society, etc., and you pay attention to those things, you have a much better, clearer idea of exactly how power itself is operating in the society, as opposed to looking, per se, at the ethnicity of someone. So you will find, in terms of economics, in terms of different things that people point to, whether it's somebody's education level, whether it's somebody's, the amount of money they have, or income they earn, or their occupation, people who are at the top of the hierarchies of society may come from a whole variety of ethnicities, right? So therefore, to be able to explain poverty itself, you can't just looking at ethnicity or the ethnic identity or origin of someone doesn't carry you very far. It'll take you only so far. You need to go further, deeper, and class allows you to do that. Once you start to ask the question of class, it's not that you are saying those things don't matter. Is that you're saying you want to go beyond, beyond just a narrow focus or lens on, and it's not just ethnicity either. There are other divisions. There are religious differences that people have as well. There's nationality issues in Liberia as well, because we're talking about Liberia, and if we're talking about wealth in Liberia, that does not include only Liberians. There are also people who move to Liberia, who are in business, who do well in business. So there are international firms that are there, and they impact. They're part of that same class system. So it's not a question of simply just nationality, all the nationalities.
So Korto, what are some of the different classes in Liberia? How does the class structure in Liberia look like today?
I think what Herbert has offered provides a framework that allows us to look at the socioeconomic status of people and how that pushes them to congregate into a particular setting, and that setting becomes a space of decision-making, a space of power, a space of influencing. There are also the political elites, and those are people who, in a way, control the state, but they are also looking at other intersecting spaces. So you may find someone who is a part of the traditional society where they get the power from, but then there's also the sort of Monrovia-based chapters around the country, you know, fraternity or sorority groups. You know, one example is the Masonic, the Freemasons. So that is also a space of not just power, but then there is a class that is created by the number of people and the kind of power that they have, the kind of privilege they have within the Liberian society. So that's the political group, but then there are people who may not be a part of those societies, and they're also connected to the church, you know, that sort of, we can make decisions about the government in a church meeting, and it really does not matter because everyone who is going to be sitting in the government meeting is in the church, or they're in the Masonic craft, or they have gone up, you know, out to someone's farm up country, that kind of thing. But then there are also the educated elites who tend to form a particular class, and where they then use their knowledge, you know, whether that knowledge comes from, you know, whatever perspective. We'll talk later, we'll talk about the sort of influence of economic systems on people's socioeconomic status. But the educated elite tend to be the ones who will lead, you know, in terms of framing, in terms of decision-making on what is supposed to be validated when it comes to either power or it comes to privilege. And they believe that their voice is really important because of that status they have as educated people within the Liberian society. And that plays out a lot when it comes to even, you know, social mobility. So how do you move, you know, from one social position to another? Yeah. Herbert mentioned that it's not just about ethnicity, it's also about, you know, education, it's about property rights. It's really about your citizenship as a Liberian and being able to exercise your rights as a Liberian. So which groups are able to do that faster? Which groups are able to own that process in a genuine way? And how does that then relate to what we say in the Constitution about equality of all persons? So it is the class system that sort of reproduces the privilege based on how it is, you know, how it's organized. It produces that class system, and in the privilege, and then in the end, you see that there are people in different, you know, spaces of the society who really believe that they have the panacea, or they have the answer to the problems of Liberia, without even seeing this as a frame where we can then analyze why we are in a particular spot and how do we move forward by recognizing the issues that our country, you know, face historically and currently. So I'll offer that as some of the examples of the different class systems we have in the country. Of course, there are people who are living in poverty who are somehow at the lowest, you know, rung of the ladder, and they are the ones who are, I guess, they have their needs unmet. They are the ones who are marginalized, and that brings us to, you know, that bigger discussion around men and women in the Liberian society. So right. The construction of gender in the Liberian society.
And that's where I was coming, because I see from what you are saying, there are so many intersections. So yes. Where does this class structure intersect with gender? You know, especially you being part of the feminist movement in Liberia. How does that play in?
Well, I think it plays in. The first thing that's important to know is that gender is a social construct. It's not natural, it's artificial. It's something that is defined by power and privilege. And it is situated and fueled by patriarchy. Patriarchy, just a simple definition, is that system that looks at male privilege as the reference for decision making. Is that system that says that women and other groups of people are subordinate to that male-dominated system. So if gender is a social construct, who's deciding how that construct looks? Who's defining the different elements of the structure? People who have power within the society, people who have the privilege, and most likely it's going to be men. There are women who will work within that system, but they do not have the power to define, to frame, and to drive. the system of patriarchy. So if you then agree that we are defining the way that women, the roles of women and the roles of men within the society, and it's quite common where, you know, men are supposed to be in charge of productive spaces. So when it comes to formal leadership, formal decision-making about, you know, our country, the government, different communities, you have a majority of those people doing that would be men, and women are then assigned to the reproductive roles and the care roles. So you are the one having the children, taking care of them, taking care of the home, domestic work, and all of that. So if we see that as the sort of picture of how a society looks, then it means that we should also try to internalize the symbol of the ladder, where women are lower than men on that ladder. And it's not, again, specific to Liberia. It's also a global thing that has affected many countries in terms of their development and their sort of socioeconomic presentation over the years. You know, that's in history. So for Liberia, it's specific in terms of the marginalization, the violence against our bodies as Liberian women and girls. It's, you know, specific when it comes to representation, where Liberia, after what we first started voting women and indigenous men, we first started voting in 1946, right, Herbert? You can correct me. And the first time since 1946, the first time we had a woman president was in 2006. Imagine that in terms of the power and the privilege that comes with being the leader or being able to, you know, represent your people. So that is, you know, specific to our country, and it is defined by class, because if there is an understanding that women are supposed to be within a particular site of development, and that site is the care site, then it means that you have already relegated them and you've already sort of stifled their social mobility to move to other spaces within a country, you know, and really exercise their rights as stated in the Constitution. So because of that class system, and you also want to, you know, we mentioned, I think earlier about intersectionality. So you also want to be able to understand that this is not just about women in terms of generic women, it's also about other social categories, you know. So what is this woman's religion? Is she a Muslim woman? Is she a Christian woman? What are the different sort of organizations that she, you know, interact with? Who's her family? What does that mean in terms of being a woman in the Liberian society and being able to exercise their rights? But we're saying that with different identities and with different sort of social categorizations, there is a resulting overlap of discrimination and exclusion. And we have a common thing in Liberia that we say, do you know who I am? And if you answer that question as a true Liberian, you'll be able to say, yes, I know you are, you know, like you could name multiple things that then validates a person. Because you know who they are and you know the different spaces that they occupy and why they are entitled to their rights. So saying that with gender, it is important to look at it politically in terms of an intersectional feminist analysis. Look at all of the different spaces, the multiple forms or multiple identities that women have, and how does that either promote them within the society or how does that harm them within the society in terms of violation of their rights.
Okay. Dr. Brewer, in America, when we look at classes, and I want for us to have some concrete examples, so we'll have the classes in Liberia by names. We have in America here upper class, or those of the old money, the new money, the middle class, the working poor, the poverty level. In Liberia, do we have such names? And if so, which class do I belong to?
So one of the things that I think would be useful is if people, is us understanding that this notion of class and your class position, if you like, your class identity, these sorts of things are fluid. They're fluid within one person's lifetime. They're also fluid intergenerationally as well, you know, historically. That again, classes form and reconstitute and form. New entrants into a particular class. That happens here in the United States. It happens in Liberia. It happens everywhere. And so we have to look at the history of the country to sort of see, how that how basically what those trends were and how things changed. One of the outcomes of our Civil War has been a complete reconstitution of our class systems in many ways. And so there have been new entrants into the ruling groups up there. There have been folks who've fallen off. One big change definitely is the removal of the migration of people away from the rural areas into the city, so that we have a very large group now of what sociologists used to call the lumpen. That's people like long-term unemployed, people, which was there, but was not of the size and consequence that it has today, for example. The urban population of the country is probably now 50% of the country's population, or probably even more. That there are more urban dwellers now in Liberia than there are rural dwellers. So that in itself is giving us an idea of the change in our class structure. So who are our classes, and how do we sort of define them that way? There are people who clearly command the commanding heights of the economy of the nation. Because Liberia is really a kind of neo-colonial, and let me put that word in there, it's part of a neo-colonial formation. That means that the commanding heights of the economy are shared by Liberians and non-Liberians. And those non-Liberians would include multinational firms. Those non-Liberians would include our, foreign investors, the phrase that everybody kind of tends to have this a positive connotation with it, though it's a complicated thing. And those people make decisions. Those people make decisions that affect everyday life in the country. It shapes and influences the power structure and what goes on in the country, etc. So, by definition, they're supposed to be added in that group who would be on top there, and in a way that makes Liberia different from the United States, clearly, because I'm arguing here that just empirically, the people who make big decisions. The most obvious kind of easy example would be Firestone, or the people who own it, Bridgestone, or Retail, Steel, and those sorts of people. The decisions they make are made not in Monrovia or Liberia. Those decisions are made somewhere else. Whereas here in the United States, when whoever Exxon or Microsoft makes the decisions, they're all right here. So that's one. But the thing is that Mittal and Firestone and the rest of them have their allies, their compradors, who are right there in Liberia, in the form of politicians, in the form of law firms, and a whole variety, sundry of supporting systems that attend to them. So we have a kind of class structure. We have a kind of ruling class that is both national and international, I guess is what would be the bottom line there. And within that group, again, I'm sure that there would be jockeying, and there's layers of them in that group. There's like the people who control the state. And now we have, because we have more democracy in Liberia than we used to have. Prior to the 1980, you could kind of like say, okay, yeah, here are the people who are running the political system. Since over the last 40 years, more and more and more, and especially within the last 15 years, we have a much more fluid sort of situation in terms of who has state power. But even within that frame, there are people who, and this was part of the argument, that was going on in our national legislature over this business of tenured positions. And people had different, people came down different parts of it, because in some other countries, the bureaucracy, the full-time and permanent civil service, is well established and institutionalized, and the political figures kind of operate around them. And although they're influential, the political figures, make decisions, the permanent bureaucracy has this sizable, acknowledgeable kind of influence on society. In Liberia, that was not the case, and I think some folks are attempting to make that the case. But our bureaucracy isn't where you would typically see the bureaucracy, permanent bureaucracy, as having this great influence. Our permanent bureaucracy really are really the agents of the political masters in Liberia. So that's another group. That meaning the political leadership and the top echelons of the bureaucracy, the people who run the police, the people who run the courts, the people who run the judiciary, all of those different forms of the state enterprises, the people who run the state enterprises. I guess you call them managing directors and that type, those sorts of people. Those are the people in that same political state class there. And then there's, of course, what I spoke about first was the private sector people. You know, those some of them who are multinational capital, some are local capital, and then of course, in terms of the agricultural sector, there's another important part who's represented in that upper that ruling class section. The people who control and own the largest amounts of land in the country, who shape that in the ground. So you have a I think general. I don't think I'm leaving anybody out here. You have a general idea of how that of that rulership. Then you have all of the people, the middling people, and we can throw a whole lot of folks in that middling group. Teachers, you know, nurses. It's a whole lot of different people who are in that middling group.
But Dr. Brewer,
small business people. I mean, shopkeepers, small business people. There's a whole bunch of different folks there. In fact, I would even put some of the market people definitely there, because all market people, there's a hierarchy even there. All the market women or the market folks are not the same. They're within the rural areas. If you look at the rural areas,
right.
not everybody has the same amount of land.
Okay. No, I said that's where I was going, because what you just listed are more of the city or Monrovia.
So even if in the rural areas, not everybody in the rural areas has the same amount of land. There's some people who are larger landholders, and some folks who are much smaller landholders.
But how are these, and it can be any one of you, how are these classes constituted? How are they structured? You know, and as you said earlier, it is fluid. How and why do people move from one class to the other?
Yeah, so as we said in the beginning, is based on, in our definition of class, is based on several factors in terms of, you know, economic status, social status, within the rural parts of the country. I'm sure there are elements that would then define, you know, who's at the top of the hierarchy. Sometimes it's about who is the custodian of cultural practices, who is seen as the, you know, which space is seen as the highest decision-making space within, you know, those communities. And then it sort of constitutes their framing of class. And that is why it's very important to understand that, yes, we have a divide, or there was a dominant divide in our country where people say, you know, this time don't talk about country and Congo. But even within the country, there will be, you know, there are divisions based on class. And even within the Congo, there are divisions based on class. I remember talking to Herbert as we were preparing for this interview, where we acknowledged that not every person who identified with the settlers who came from, you know, the US and the settlers who came from the Caribbean, not every person in, let's say, the 1900s in Liberia, or, you know, after independence, or even in the early 60s and 70s, you know, they were not all rich people who had government jobs and went to school, you know, at Harvard. Similarly, it was not the same with families that came from the rural areas. So there were divisions, and those divisions were marked by class and other, you know, sort of factors. And I think, you know, just by saying that, there is a theory that I want to put forward, and you know, I think I talked to you about it, Herbert, is that whole theory of the center and the periphery. So because the whole idea of having a ruling class, or a class that has the most socioeconomic or the highest status, whether it comes to socioeconomic spaces or political spaces, that group of people who sort of cover all of those spaces and are the ones who are actually making decisions within the country. In Liberia, long ago, they were called the Congo people. So today, people have even the argument whether Congo is a tribe, an ethnic group, or Congo was a class within the Liberian society. So if you watch the way we interact and the way we, you know, move within the Liberian society, someone who comes from, and I'll give an example, this is just random, someone who comes from Bon County, goes to school, maybe lives in the rural parts of the country of Liberia for the first 18 years of their life, come to the University of Liberia, get a degree, go to the law school, get a degree, and maybe get an opportunity to go to the University of Chicago. Let me just say that. That person comes back to Liberia, and you will hear in some quarters where people say, you have now become a Congo man.
Yeah.
And the difficulty or the challenge of that is embedded in that whole theory of the center and the periphery. So people who are not seen as Congo people are on the periphery. The center is where we are supposed to have all of the power, all of the, sort of ideal elements of the society. These are the things that we're all, hoping to achieve within the society. And within that space, within that center, you put one ethnic group, which in a way makes people to think that if you are on the periphery, you cannot have social mobility. And when you have social mobility, you are moving towards that particular class, because it's only those people of that ethnic group or people who occupy that particular space, with similar characteristics, they are the ones who are entitled to that space of the center, where you have formal national decision-making, where you have, leadership around politics, where you have economic resources, control over economic resources and assets of the state. So it's important to, connect that to how does Liberia look today? Yeah. Who is then seen as a Congo people or Congo person? Who is then in the leadership position? Say, for example, you have people in leadership position in the government, and there is a huge argument about them not fitting a particular template. That template, for me, derives from the whole idea of what is supposed to be at the center. What are the values of the center? And if that is not validated by, say, for example, the elites that, people who ruled the government long ago, or people who are rich enough, or, as Herbert mentioned, even our international partners in different groups, if it does not fit that template and they are not seen as go-to people that would then work in a way, whether it's collusion or whether it's, collaboration, to ensure that this whole, all of the pieces and all of the blocks around corporate power, collusion of the state, and how that enables a flow of the status quo. That is, important for us to be able to examine by looking at the structural causes, by looking at the different theories, and by understanding that we have a history of encouraging all of these things, of holding all of these things and owning them. So now in current Liberia as it is, what is the challenge? It's the challenge that there is someone who is in leadership position, for example, someone who is in the Senate or, in the legislature generally, who we feel is not performing. Why do we feel that? What is the template that we're using? What is precedent? What is it that we feel should be happening? And that could be, grounded in different sort of values that may not necessarily be, realistic.
Okay. Dr. Brewer, let me go back to this class and ethnicity. We see that, our history before 1980, we have one group of Liberians dominating power and also wealth. So that became a very elite class. And in order for you to be somebody, be educated or aspire for political power, you must align with that class. That moved on to the coup of 1980 when power shifted. And you have an indigenous president, Samuel Doe, taking power, moving with him some indigenous people. So that became the ruling class, very powerful. It moved through until today we have President Weah. What do you say about this notion of this ruling class shifting from one ethnic group to the other? Right now, if you see around President Weah, there are being chatter of the government being tribal. Some argue that no, people around the president are not of his ethnic group. So where do we see ourselves today as we move through history of this class, ethnicity, and power?
It's a good question. That's the Southwest class, right? That's the Southwest tribe. I'm trying to be funny.
Southeast.
You know, right before our very own eyes, with this, because I've been reading people keep making reference to the Southwesterners. Right before our very own eyes, we see proof of what Korto was referring to earlier when she said that, you know, gender is a social construct. Ethnicity is also a social construct, you know, so is class. All of these things are social constructs. I mean, we're human beings, basically is what we are. We're not born, you know, belonging to this tribe, this ethnicity, this. I mean, these are things that I acquired, to socialize, etc. You know, as time goes on. I would disagree actually with the assumption behind even the argument that the suggestion that whoever the political ruler of the country is, whoever has political power, whoever holds the office of president is therefore the ruling class. I would disagree. That is not what class is. So therefore then the notion that you know, this particular ethnicity becomes class. Immediately then the two things are brought together as if they're the same, but they're not. Korto had just mentioned that, well, you know, there are people who, and empirically we can show this. There are people who, when Tubman was president, you know, not everybody who was his friend from, well, maybe his friend, but not everybody who came from the same place and the same space and the same social background as him benefited from his presidency. Likewise, Dole, not everybody who came from Grand Gila benefited from Dole, and we can go straight through, you know, with that. And not only that each of these people throughout that history had people from within their own cultural backgrounds who were opposed to them politically, you know, and that again, we can demonstrate all of these things empirically. So it's a kind of large claim to just equate ethnicity as we understand it with class. Those two things are rather different there. The people who ran the country, and I mean, I'll just make the point again, the people who run the country are not merely, and sometimes even principally, the political leadership of the country. And when we talk about that particular class, and I guess we're focusing quite a bit, maybe that's fine, on who rules Liberia, you know, we have to broaden our conception of rulership. When we talk about rulership, who makes these decisions, these critical decisions, you know, who really has that sort of power at the end of the day, both in terms of you know, that have resources under the control, but also in terms of how they validate ideas, you know, how they propagate ideas, how they grant permission, those sorts of things, that sort of authority that they carry. So I'm just saying all of that again to get us back to thinking about class a little bit more deeply, and an indirect answer to that question of ethnicity, to understand ethnicity as a sort of, as a cultural identity, very valid, very important, etc., but not to confuse it with class, in which where there definitely can be overlap, but they're not the same thing. Class, we're referring here now to the way in which power itself is operating in the society, and that's the with all of the factors that come into play when power is being exercised in the society. Now, we can, I guess you've been asking for, we can look at examples under the Truic Party, which, if you think about the Truic Party, you know, and you think about how it was constituted and how it operated, the Truic Party has all types inside it, you know, into how the decisions were being made about the Truic Party. Just now we're talking about how, for example, when, I know for Liberians, even that word Congo, let's look at that word for a minute. That word itself has a history, you know, the way it has changed, the meaning actually of that word has actually changed over time. And if somebody said Congo back in 1960, really, it does not carry the same connotation or meaning that it has right today. You know, it has changed. And so now there's a tension, you know, as it's kind of in a way what has transformed more from a kind of cultural identity or, you know, ethnic identity to more of a kind of class identity that's you know, in an informal way. That's where it's going. You know, once upon a time in Liberia, I don't know the extent to which the word has gained currency, even though it's been there and people know it was the word Kui. When Liberians refer to somebody as Kui, you know, it actually, to me, comes closer to explaining, you know, that particular class than even Congo does, even though again Congo is in more widespread usage. And again, we can interrogate the words some more, both of them, you know, to kind of get a grip. I think that the people have the sense of, yeah, just the social hierarchies, yes, where power lies, yeah, the people who have class privileges, etc. You know, and so you kind of, as humans, we want to classify, want to label these things, and want to be able to understand them. But insisting on thinking about class brings some clarity, you know, forces us really to then again to go beyond the narrow limitations, I would argue, of ethnicity and of, you know, that sort of more common, easy way of explaining privilege and inequality, in the imbalance, of marginalization, you know, all of those things. So I'll put it another kind of way. The people who have class privileges in the society, right? They are at the center, as you're saying. You know, they have access to power. They are validators. They're all of these things about them. The characteristics of a particular privileged class. They share these things in common, but, you know, without exception, you know, by definition, the fact that you in those positions of power, you know, that explains who you are. But while your ethnicity is part of your identity, you will never find 100% of that ethnicity inside that place. You won't find that. And I think Dennis, you had asked that question you had raised that point in your questioning. Those people who formed alliances with the old Whig Party, the Ancien Regime, who did not come from the American descent, you know, and those people joined. They were part of that. They were part of that league. They were part of that group, even without losing their ethnicity. You know, and we talk. And if you want to go into into Liberia itself, not just Monrovia, Jusu Donor. I mean, I could call names there. You know, Puto Barkley. There's a whole lot of these folks in different parts from the country. They ruled in particular areas. You know, they were dominant in particular areas. You know, and they carried much authority, and they made big decisions. They were close to the centers of power. They were part of that ruling class of Liberia.
Thank you. And if you are just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. We are discussing class structures in Liberia. And I want to bring in my audience. If you want to call to join the conversation, please call 978-726-6965. We have a few comments from on Facebook. Larry Davis, and after that, we want to talk about class struggle and class aspiration in Liberia. Larry Davis says, are the Lebanese the elite class, or the Chinese, are they the elite class? Hold on, don't answer yet. Sam Govo said there can also be division within a class. Example would be the division within a settler class in Liberia, mulatto and black settlers. And the other comment from Sam Govo, there are different kinds of classes: economic, social, political. Can you view class or classes to be dynamic or static? I think you spoke to that earlier. And so those are on the global scheme, class has now primarily morphed into the educated elite, except for Liberia. That's a comment from Solofini Adams. Korto, if you can respond to any of those comments.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, some of what has been said, you know, whether questions or comments, reinforce, you know, what we have been discussing about class, the fact that it is not static, the fact that Liberia has changed, you know, from, you know, in time, progressively, there are new definitions and new elements that define how we understand class. It's also true that, and we said it, you know, earlier, that within different groups of people, you will have issues related to, and not so much issues, but you will have the categories of, you know, wealth, control, power, and privilege. And it could be within different groups, but it could also be intra. So you may have the Congo people where it's different, and I'm using Congo loosely here, please bear with me. You have the country people, again, a word that I don't like to use because I think it's derogatory, but you know, you will have that sort of intra categories around social economic status and all of that. So I agree generally to what has been said. I think one point, and maybe we could talk about it a bit, is the one about the educated people in Liberia not being a part of the elite system. Is that what was said? That is how I understand it. Or they are not elites. I believe that, you know, and if that is what that person was presenting, I believe that educated people in Liberia are elites. And the reason we're elites is because our the literacy levels in Liberia, they're so low that what may be seen as very common in other countries, so someone has a master's degree or someone has a college degree, if you compare that to Liberia, you realize that an undergrad degree is seen as more important, you know, than many other countries where it's quite common. So in a way, there is a particular privilege that comes with that. There's a particular power that comes with that. Economically, you have the opportunity to go out and access resources through a job, doing business, you know, that kind of thing. However, being an elite is different from elitism. And I think that's really for definitional purposes, because if you go to social media, you see a lot of people say, oh, you guys are the elites. Yes, sometimes we are elites without even asking for it. And that's just the sort of development context or the development challenge that we have in Liberia around education. But when you are elitist, then it is somehow associated with what we're discussing around class, power, privilege, and being a part of the dominant group in the country that controls, you know, assets and resources. So the issue of the Lebanese people, I will dare to say that, yes, the Lebanese people in Liberia or non-Liberian or non-Negro businessmen in Liberia do form a part of the elite system because they have, you know, that economic control, they have businesses, they have resources, they can even influence the state with the kind of power that they have. So I will get to that, and then I will, you know, turn over to Herbert if you want to respond to.
Let me bring in a caller on the line before Herbert come in. Caller, your name and where you calling from?
Yes, my name is Professor. My name is Professor Lawrence Davis. How are you?
I'm good, Professor Davis. Welcome to Focus on Liberia. Your question or comment?
Yeah, I just got a question. Well, it's basically a comment. It seems to me that, as I mentioned in my message, that now the elite classes in Liberia today are the Lebanese and Chinese immigrants. The so-called Americo-Liberians, the descendants of African Americans and West Indians, many of those folks left the country. I mean, for example, Reshamu Dennis, who is a billionaire today, and Wilmot Collins, who is the mayor of, I think, he's out in Montana, he's running for the Senate. Many of those folks who were so-called, if you will, Americo-Liberians, who had capital, they left the country because of the Civil War. And so there are very, very few of those folks in the country. And so now the new power structure really is in the hands of the Chinese and the Lebanese, and very, very few, if you will, Liberians have capital. And like I say, the Americos, if you will, left and went back to the United States or to some other part of the world because they weren't welcome. So that's just my comments.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Davis.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
All right.
I mean, I disagree with him. Empirically, I don't think that the Lebanese are more influential than they were before. And I'm saying empirically, if you kind of went out there to see what they owned, assets, their investments, etc. And the Chinese are here today, but you know, yesterday it was somebody else. It was the Germans at some point. Liberia's entire history has been, you know, it's had the sort of non-Liberians at some point or the other with influential stakes in the economy. So just empirically, I would challenge that. I would also actually even disagree with the examples he give of Liberians leaving because I think that it might probably come as a surprise to some of those successful Liberian diaspora that they were elites in Liberia before they left to left. I think Wilma Collins would probably be surprised at that.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's a difference between elite and class, and I think it's important it really is a conceptual distinction there, and we should make that distinction. Elites. When we talk about elites, we're not really talking about class, because you have elites in a whole variety of areas, and I think some examples were given of that, political and non-political, and I think somebody who had commented before. So elites, and people confuse, and similar to how people confuse, I would say, class and ethnicity many times, conflating the two things in the Liberian case. They also conflate elite and the upper class, so to speak, as well. Again, so elite basically is a very wishy-washy kind of term. It doesn't have that much, I would argue, rigor in terms of applying, using it to apply, applying it in terms of explaining what is going on in the society there. Class, what's fundamental about class is that class, by definition, explains antagonism and explains a kind of, there can't just be one class in a class system. We have a class system. One class is opposed to another class, and they've got these different sorts of interests. And so you might have elites in that class, but nonetheless, these class interests are very kind of specific. I know a bit of the history of that term elite. I know where it comes from. I know how in the United States social sciences, especially in the post-war era, 20th century, that term is developed as a sort of alternative, actually, a way of, I would argue, obfuscating, basically hiding the sort of class interests and antagonism that exist in the society. Kind of like, let's talk about elites. So everybody can grab the term elite and run around with it. The president of the United States today runs around and calls people opposed to him elites, too, the liberal elites or whatever. But class forces you to look at the economic and political bases of inequality in the society. When you talk about class, it's a whole. The implications are different, and which is one reason I think that term is a useful term. So for Liberia and Liberians today, it helps us get to why, again, certain kinds of decisions are being made, right? About how power itself is distributed, how it's organized in society, those sorts of things. Whereas again, elite is, it's kind of like, and in a way, I'll kind of finish off by bringing this question of educated people, So the book people are now the elite, the educated elites. Yeah. And so the people have an education, yes, they do, but how much power do they really have? We're not saying they don't have some influence, that they might not have some access, but how much power really do the most educated people have? And then they might claim it. They might say, well, I have a big degree now, and therefore I'm entitled to a particular job, I have status in the society, and those sorts of things. But what's the class basis, of their power? That's a whole other kind of, what means of production do they really have? What level of wealth do they have? Somebody making a salary, even if it's a decent salary, isn't necessarily somebody who is on top there in that ruling class, capitalist and big, important business and those sorts of things. And again, that clarity is also necessary in this conversation. Many in Liberia, it's like a middle class, really, educated people getting into the middle class, which is not the same thing as the folks who are on top there, making these crucial decisions.
That brings me to a question on Facebook from Dave Ja. To what extent has Liberia's class system been established through corruption and oppression and not through innovation and hard work?
No class system is none in history is established through innovation and hard work. All of it is established through corruption and oppression. All, no exception, my friend. That's not what the show is about. But and definitely in Liberia's case, no.
And I think that's why we talk about privilege, because privilege is usually unearned. It's not something that, you're privileged because you are supposed to be. It's unearned. So that privilege that empower that people have, that they then strengthen their the sight of difference with other people, if that's how we want to call class. It's really what feeds the class system. So I don't think it's about working to establish it honestly. Yeah, I don't think it's that way. But one point that I think we should highlight, I know we're talking about Liberia internally, like what is happening in country, but then there's also the sort of economic systems and international governance systems that define the way that the country is run. So that's also another kind of power. So where you have the World Bank, the IMF, and the kind of, prescriptions and policies that they didn't say, this is how a government acts to be able to fit into the global economic system. If you don't do that, you're either punished or you're sort of ostracized. That is something that also define our class system. So who are the go-to people? Who are the people who understand that neoliberal sort of definition of our economic system and can apply it? So those are the ones who then become the bodies, the sort of allies of the international governance system. And sometimes it may not necessarily be someone who is in government or a minister of finance. I think it's important to include this in the discussion because it also then reinforces this class system that we've been talking about, socioeconomic status, access to wealth, the issue around corporate control and land and how that affects people's livelihood. I think it's important to look at that. How people continue to remain in poverty. Then you have a class that is, at the top, making all of the political decisions, but
Right.
likely not in the face of leadership.
And as you understand, of course, sorry, Dennis, I kind of have to go, but I really, in Korto, you just mentioned a bit about land, and we've been, think about the various ways in which class operates, the dynamics. A big issue for Liberia and for Liberians to consider is the extent to which the land system underpins class and how it underpins this class privilege, underpins this power, underpins, the reproduction, etc. What I'm saying really in the context of Liberia, or the history of the country, is that Liberia's adaptation with the formation of the Liberian state in the 19th century, one of the things that comes there is private property and how we understand private property in this modern juridical legal system that we have. And that is a major part of the reproduction of the class system, the way the class system is maintained in the country, that system of private land ownership. Recently there have been attempts to sort of smooth over these divisions, but it's going to be there. It's going to be a major source of conflict. It's one of the ways in which actually that class conflict in Liberia occurs, meaning this conflict over land. Who owns it and how it gives certain people power, how it allows people to accumulate capital, how it keeps others at the margins of society. That's a big issue that folks sort of stay away from. And it meaning this business of the notion of the land tenureship system that we have, private property, etc. It's usually presented in a neutral fashion. It's just a question of somebody owns the deed and you bring your deed.
Who has the oldest deed?
Yes, but that's not the issue, really. Behind it actually is the history. The person who called or who wrote said, oh, what about innovation and hard work? No, people who have wealth today, it's based on some prior accumulation, some prior creation of a structure, of an economic, legal, political structure that basically bakes in, if you like, the inequalities in the society. And that's what, I don't know whether the people at the Land Commission have this, but if we had a chart or a map in front of us, showing who owns the land in Liberia, it would be very instructive.
Right. And this
how land distribution operates, and then of course, therefore, how inequality, structurally, basically, is maintained. That's
right.
Yeah, I think it's also about the institutions that we rely on to mediate and define, ownership. Who has access to those institutions? Who
controls them?
Work? Yeah.
Right. So I mean, and there's so much to talk about, but we are unfortunately out of time. This is just the beginning of the discussion. So we definitely, please promise me that you are coming back so we can continue this discussion.
I promise.
Okay.
Korto?
Till death do us part.
Great. So because the follow-up to that question was, okay, then how do these people coexist? Because they've been exploited they have, through exploitation and corruption, they have come to this upper class. How do they coexist with those that they exploited? But let me get my last caller so we can wrap this up. Caller, your name and where you calling from?
Yeah, my name is Bill Quintus Kamara, calling from the state of New Jersey, city of Newark.
Thank you. Your question or comment for 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been following the show and I appreciate two guests that are explaining some of the cardinal issues in Liberia. And I listened to Mr. Herbert and he was explaining something about private property. And I do agree with him. This is something that affected not only Liberia, but Africa as a whole. Many of the political issues are all being tied to ethnic barrier, properties rights protection, and we call it properties rights protection, especially with our land commissioner, the issue of entitlement and the issue of civil responsibility in terms of public domain, eminent domain. So in Liberia, we say government on all the land, eminent domain, but land, there are people who have title to this land ownership and administrative rights. So how can we solve this problem, especially with properties rights protection? Looking at our constitution now, that people are in abroad, they have different citizenship, they want to go back home and claim their properties after 20 years, 50 years, and we are not dual citizenship country. And our law says that once you have ownership or citizenship in another country, you automatically lost your citizenship. So how do we reconcile that? If I had a property 20, 50 years ago, and I'm abroad, I have different ownership, and I enter Bali Liberia, I want to claim my property. I just wanted to explain that a little bit.
Thank you. And Dr. Brewer, I want you to wrap that into your final comments, but let me read comments on Facebook before you respond to that question with your final comments, and I go to Korto and then we close. Maurice Slew say, good day, Mr. Moderator. I told you the last time that your show is centered around people who hold PhD. However, I got few words about those who hold PhD. Those people feel superior to we, the uneducated and common people. So put the two in one, and let me have your final thought before we can close the broadcast. Let me start with you, Dr. Brewer.
I'm a small D Democrat, and that simply means that not a party, that I'm definitely not better than anybody in the world, just another human being who had actually privileges, and I would like to acknowledge that privilege. And sometimes actually people tend not to even sort of do that. My circumstances, I didn't earn it. I inherited certain circumstances, that had me here. Actually, it is sacrifice and hard work and many other things on the part of countless Liberians, nameless, who I don't even know, that have me in the place where I am today, that allowed my ancestors to get me to where I am. So I can acknowledge that easily. I know that it's not simply, and there are many people who go around, it's my hard work, all my sweat that I put into into getting to where I'm getting to. And we're not saying that people don't work. We're simply saying that you work in a context. Everything has a context when you live. There's a historical context, there's a social political context. And maybe the first step might be just people acknowledging that, understanding that. It can take them a long way, in terms of, I guess in parts people think about reconciling and learning lessons from the past and that sort of thing in the context of Liberia. again, this is I'm glad we're starting. I think we should continue the conversation. Liberia is a society that has a history built on oppression, built on exploitation. It's important to understand why the society is the way it is today. The society is not the way it is today simply because there are one or two bad people running who are in control or in charge. It's not as simple as that. There's a whole history. We need to understand that history and how that history contributed to the dysfunction that we see. And people have been, despite all of that, people have attempted, to make a better life for themselves. And I'm all for continuing that dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. And with that, we can go to Korto and take leave of you, since you have to go. Korto, you can give us your final thoughts and the two comments, one from our caller and the one that I read.
Yeah, I'll respond to the one that was read because the caller, I guess, was stating a problem and how we resolve that issue or resolve that crisis is something that goes into, a longer conversation. One of the things that we should do as Liberians is to acknowledge that we may have more in common than the differences that we talk about. And it's that tension between not recognizing what we have in common, not recognizing common ground and assigning labels to people. I think that is, a big part of the tensions we have in terms of, living as Liberian citizens and contributing to the development of our country for transformation. So you bring a lot of PhD people, on the show. What does that really mean? It's loaded in terms of the way we see people and the way that they perform as citizens. It's also about being able to, it's enabling the whole formation of, a class system in the country that because they're educated, because they have PhD, they're somehow different. They are the ones who are, they're stealing all of the money, they control everything. And sometimes those assignments are artificial. So it's important to look at that within the frame of conflict, the tensions we have, power, privilege. And where there's privilege, I agree with Herbert, we have to own that. It's not every Liberian woman who is going to be called on this show to do an interview. I don't have a PhD. It's just that I've been working. I went to school, but I've also been working for close to 25 years, trying to understand my country in a way, it functions. So what are the, ideal things about Liberia? What are the specific things? And how can we put that into a framework to understand ourselves better and to ensure that our country becomes, the sort of place that we're proud of. So I just, want to stop here and say thank you for inviting me. I think the conversation was about defining, but it was also about providing alternative conversations that when we talk about the complexities of Liberia, it is not just watered down to someone's identity, but what do we consider to be the structural causes of where we find ourselves, where we think that, there's a deficit in leadership, there's a lack of accountability. What is the history behind that? And why, in most cases, we assume, that someone is, say, for example, someone is a killer, but we know someone who is a killer, and there's proof that that person evidence, but we don't call them that. And we say, let's see that in the code of law. So it's based on something, our thoughts, our positioning on Liberia, our political, ideas about Liberia, all of those things are informed by worldviews. Our worldviews are somehow, derived from the class that we find ourselves in. So I'd like to add there, to end there and say that this is a deeper conversation. Thank you, Herbert. It's an honor to, listen to you and to be on this show with you. Thank you, Dennis, for inviting us. And it's a longer conversation that we can somehow change that simplistic, sometimes, really tense categorization of our problems, or explanation of our problems in Liberia.
Thank you so much. I already have your promise that you're coming back. So focus on Liberia. Keep tuned. We are coming back at 6 o'clock for our prime time show. So don't go far off. We'll soon be back at 6 o'clock to have a conversation with Mr. George Lobo. Until then, from all of us here at FOL, we say thank you, goodbye, and God bless you.
Thank you.
We are one people, people,